So I'm here to talk about the IEP process and advocating for your child with a visual impairment through the IEP process and their unique needs. As I'm sure you guys have figured out pretty quickly that their needs are hard to meet through the general education curriculum, and it's going to be, it can be challenging to get what you need for your child. So I wanted to talk a little bit about myself because I am a school psychologist in the secondary program. So you might be like, why are you here for the Early Connections Conference for kids 0 to 7 when I work with mainly high schoolers? So my journey to get to this program was I'm in my 3rd year of practice currently as a school psychologist, my 2nd year of practice at Perkins School for the Blind specifically. For my 1st year, I worked in the Cambridge Public School program as a team chair. So that means I was running IEP meetings, I was making eligibility determinations, and I was making placement determinations. And I was transitioning children from the special start, or from early intervention to the special start preschool program. So that was when the kids turn 3 and they go from early intervention to special education. I was in charge of that process. Like I just said. And then I also did my training. I did some time in Boston Public Schools, in the public school district there. And then I also interned at the Perkins Deafblind program. And I've also been a personal care assistant to a deafblind child since 2017. And I worked with that family all throughout my graduate career. So when I first started graduate school, I hadn't figured out that I liked working with really complex students yet. I knew that I wanted to work with students with needs that were more significant than a general education student, but I didn't realize that I was passionate about working with students with complex needs and sensory impairments. So as I started working with a little girl named Mila, she's actually a student at Perkins, I was a PCA for her, and I really worked and discovered my love of working with students with those complex needs. So Mila, when I first started working with her, she was still in her home district. She was attending Brookline Public Schools, and she was in a substantially separate classroom. This means she was in one classroom with only other students with IEPs, and that's all that she was with throughout her entire day. So she didn't interact with any general education students. And when I started working with Mila, they'd been just started going through the mediation process, and her school district wasn't giving her goals or objectives that were allowing her to make effective progress. So what that meant is that the placement wasn't right for her, and it was just up to the school district to also figure that out. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my ideology and also Perkins. I believe all people have value, and that it's not limited by a person's ability level. All children are entitled to and deserve meaningful educational experiences. You may hear something different along your journey to an IEP, but I'm sorry that they're having so much more fun than we are. I don't have any music because unfortunately there's no songs about IEPs, but if it were, I would have included them. So I just want to make sure that when you're starting to go through these processes and sit as an IEP team member, that your child deserves to have as meaningful an educational experience as any other child. It doesn't matter if that costs more, it doesn't matter if you need more team members, it doesn't matter. Your child deserves that. And disability should be seen as a facet of human diversity and not as a deficit. I'm not gonna lie, I totally plagiarized that from somewhere I found it, and I loved the way that they put how I believe and how I feel, that diversity is just part of being human, and there's a lot of people that have disabilities that you don't even notice. And it should just be like having a different color hair or being a different race. It's just a facet of human diversity. It's okay if your child is developing differently than you expected. Setting high expectations is essential to your child's development. And always assume that your child has age-appropriate understanding. So what that means is you're going to presume competence when you talk to your child. When you presume competence, you always are approaching your child with respect. And a lot of times, children who are nonverbal or with more significant needs, they may seem to be not getting as much information from the environment, but you don't know that for sure. Sometimes kids are picking up a lot more than what you realize, and it's important to respect that and to just presume competence, because then you can meet them where they're at a lot easier, and you can always include more information or give more support, but you always want to start with that presumption of competence. So you and your child, I'm just going to go over here real quick. Sorry, I know I'm not supposed to cross in front of the presentation. I just want to grab my water. So you and your child, you know your child best, better than anybody else does. And you're likely going to be the expert on your child, for sure. So this is a pie chart that represents all of the different federal disability classifications. So there's 14 recognized there's 14 recognized disability classifications. So they go from TBI, traumatic brain injury, emotional impairment, orthopedic impairment, specific learning disability, hearing impairment, language impairment, autism, multiple disabilities, intellectual impairment, deafblind, developmental delay, visual impairment, and other health impairment. Other health impairment includes ADHD, just so you guys know. So the visual impairment percentage is 0.3%. And deafblind is 0.02% of the special education population. So you're going to know more than most of the team members that you're working with. You're going to be the expert on your child. But you're probably thinking there's definitely more kids than that in the population, and they are, but they're kind of hidden in this extra category, multiple disabilities. And that's one thing that we'll talk more about later is multiple disabilities. I don't love that it's even an option because it really strips away some of the information about your child and their disability from their IEP, and it makes it so team to team can't really grasp as much about your child as if they had all of their disability classifications represented individually. So that might look like a primary disability in Massachusetts, and then a secondary disability, maybe it's an intellectual impairment, and then also, or maybe there could even be a tertiary one trying to see a good one that goes with it, specific learning disability. So you can have a child that's affected by all different aspects of disability, but it's important to have each one of those categories outlined just to make sure nothing falls through the cracks as your child's career advances over time. You are your child's #1 advocate. There will never be someone more devoted to your child's education than you. You are going to be the most committed to their success, the most passionate about their success, and the most willing to work for their success. So don't be afraid to speak up. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And remember, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And this is going to be an important thing to remember throughout the entire thing, that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, because in a loving way, of course, but since I am a school psychologist, I work with individual families. Thank you so much. And because I work with individual families, I always call our families the squeaky wheels. You don't get to Perkins unless you're a squeaky wheel. So don't feel bad about squeaking your wheels, because that is your job as parents. So we're going to start with the basics of the IEP. What is an IEP? It's an individual education program. Is anyone here's child currently on an IEP? A couple. And what about an IFSP? Okay, so that's going to be the difference between an early intervention child and then a child who's already in the special education field. So an IEP is a legal document that outlines the agreement between team members on what a student needs to access the general education curriculum. And accessing the general education curriculum is what the IEP is all about. So this is going to include, so team members will be on your child's team, and these are going to include the education team, the legal guardians, so that's you, and the student. The IEP ensures that a student receives free, appropriate public education, FAPE. This is one of the most important things that an IEP does, is it ensures that your child receives the education that they are entitled to. Like I said before, every child deserves meaningful educational experiences, so ensuring that there's FAPE is #1. And the other part that the IEP is really addressing is ensuring that your child's in the least restrictive environment, so the LRE. And that is going to be, can range from anywhere from the general education to a residential placement. So you're going to have anywhere in between that your child might end up. So how do you get an IEP? There are different paths. If your child's already receiving early intervention services, typically who you work with to receive those services will refer you before the third birthday to be evaluated for special education. So this might be your SLP, your PT, your OT. They might say, hey, your child's getting close to their 3rd birthday. You might want to reach out to your district, which is where you live, so the town that you live in. And then you'll be asking for an evaluation for special education services. So this process is a transition from an individual family service plan, the IFSP that I told you, to an IEP. So this is really, I do like the IFSP a lot better than the IEP because I love how it's really collaborative with the family and it's really taking all of the different aspects of a child's environment and addressing all of them. But I definitely think that, and then you go to the IEP and that's just special education and it's just addressing the child's needs. So it can be a little bit of a pulling back of services, it might feel like, but it really is when we start focusing on the child and their development. I wish that there was more of a family involvement throughout, but we get what we get, unfortunately. So, and if your child is not receiving early intervention services, you or your pediatrician can request that your child is evaluated for special education. So this could be you emailing your school district, the director of special education, and saying, hi, my child turns 3, I'm worried about maybe milestones they're not hitting, I'd like them to be evaluated for services. And then as long as you have a reason for referral, that's how you can get your child evaluated. And this process can start as early as 6 months before their 3rd birthday. And this is just to ensure there's no disruption in services between when they turn 3 and when they enter this special education system, because you don't want there to be a time where services lapse. All right, so now we're going to go into the initial process. So it starts with eligibility determination. So this is determining, does your child have a disability? Obviously, this is a little different for children with sensory impairments because children with sensory impairments are a little more clear cut that they have that disability. So this starts with the IEP determining whether a student meets the criteria to receive special education services. This is determined through a comprehensive evaluation and a team discussion. And we're going to review all of the criteria that you need to qualify for an IEP. So before your child receives any IEP services, they must be evaluated. If your child isn't evaluated, that's a major red flag. So this evaluation will look different for every student as it's based on what the reason is for the referral. So the referral question is really what's driving that. So if it's your child has just the visual impairment and you're noticing they're still meeting most of their developmental milestones, that's great, and maybe that's all you need. You just need services from a TVI to learn, or services from an O&M instructor to learn orientation and mobility skills. But some students might need more support. That might need help with regulating their emotions in addition to O&M skills. So it really is different for everyone. To begin any evaluation process, signed consent for each area must be obtained from a student's legal guardian if your signature is not on that paper, or if you don't give consent to a certain type of assessment to being done, those can't be done. And these are the different types of evaluators you might see. So it might be a school psychologist, a speech and language pathologist, occupational therapist, a TVI, teacher of the visually impaired, orientation and mobility instructor, physical therapist, or a special education teacher. So the pre-evaluation conference. The pre-evaluation conference is an optional meeting that caregivers or parents can request prior to the evaluation taking place. And this meeting can be used to discuss any concerns you may have, ask which assessments might be used to evaluate the student, and to find out who will be completing the evaluation. To get one of these meetings, you have to request it. It's not a part of the typical IEP process, but it is captured in the federal law, so it is a right that you have. And so you'll see the squeaky wheel little icon there that came in through the slide, and that is to tell you this is a point of advocation for you, or a point for you to advocate for your child. So to ensure the appropriate evaluation, it's important to consider when reviewing the results of any evaluation report the level of familiarity the evaluator has with your child's disability. If this is the first time they're ever evaluating a child with a visual impairment, it's likely that they don't know exactly what they're doing. And they might not get the same results as someone who has more experience. So you want to ask, did the evaluators adapt assessment procedures to account for sensory impairments? There are no cognitive assessments. There are some assessments, but most assessments are normed on a sighted population, and they are not normed on a visually impaired or blind population. So that is really important to consider. Are we comparing apples to oranges or apples to apples? In most cases, it's apples to oranges, but you have to remember your child throughout their entire life will be compared to their sighted peers. So it's important that we know where they're at in terms of the world that they live in instead of the world we wish they lived in. Another question is, did the evaluator include language that tells the reader to interpret the results with caution? Because the tools aren't standardized on students with sensory impairments. So this is going to be it might just be a little blurb somewhere that's in italics or in bold or something that says, please, these results should be interpreted with caution. These tests are not as accessible to children with sensory impairments. You know, we can only get so much information from these. Please interpret with caution. If you don't see that, or if you see the child did the best they could or something like that, another red flag. And then finally, was a TVI consulted or included on the IEP team? If there isn't a TVI on your child with a visual impairment IEP team, or your child who's deafblind, or your child who is 100% blind, I think we've missed something there, because the teacher of the visually impaired needs to be included to teach a child who is visually impaired, blind, or deafblind. So if you answer no to any of those questions, it's important to ask the team if they're able to make an appropriate determination if they're not able to get the accurate information or the best information. So it's important to make sure that your team is doing their due diligence. So once your child has been evaluated, the IEP team will meet to discuss the results. The following discussion about the results will be about the IEP team chair will ask at the end of reviewing all the results if you agree with the findings of the results. And usually this is literally just a yes or no question. Do you agree with these evaluations? Do you agree with these assessments? And you guys are allowed to say no. And if you say no, you have another opportunity to get an independent education and evaluation. So that is something you have to request if you don't agree with the results that you received from your district or whoever they contracted to do it. In most cases, what they will do is they will request your financial information so that they are able to see if you can afford the independent educational evaluation. You guys don't have to give that to them. Federally, you're not required to give them your financial information, and you can refuse to give it. And typically, if you refuse to give it, them trying to get you to pay for it kind of just goes away. Not in all cases. Sometimes some districts won't keep going with that, but in a lot of cases, it's more trouble than it's worth, and they just end up footing the cost of the independent evaluation. So try not to disclose your financials if you can't. If you are in a financial place where you do think you would qualify for it to be covered by the district, that's your choice, but usually just not sharing that information in general is a good way to kind of get around that. So reviewing the criteria for eligibility. In Massachusetts, we have a cute little flow chart that everybody goes through, and it has two major questions, but question 2 has different parts. So the first question is, does the student or child have more than one disability? Like I said before, there are 14 different recognized disability classifications, and we reviewed them previously, so I won't subject you to them again, but disability classification can really vary a lot state to state. In Massachusetts, TBI, which is traumatic brain injury, falls under the neurological impairment classification. However, that classification does not exist in any of the other states. It's only in Massachusetts. So the federal term for an emotional or mental health illness is going to be emotional, I think it's I forget the exact, we call it emotional impairment in Massachusetts. And I think it's, let's see, I think I have it written here. I think it's emotional disturbance. That's what the federal government refers to it as. So it's a little bit harsher than what we refer to it here in Massachusetts. So it's important to understand what they're talking about if you're in a different state from Massachusetts, because it can really vary based on where you live. So there's also a special category called developmental delay classification. This one has special criteria, and it's reserved for children who are in between ages 3 and 9. So this is going to be for children where there's a suspected developmental issue, whether it's an intellectual impairment or other developmental condition like autism. And so if you're getting an intellectual impairment diagnosis before the age of 9, I would say that's a huge red flag. We don't know what children are going to do in that 6 years. There's a lot of development that happens. The spectrum of what 3-year-olds can look like is very wide. A 3-year-old might be, some 3-year-olds can read and others aren't even speaking at that point. But that doesn't mean that it's an intellectual impairment. It might just mean that they're on a slower rate of development. So it really is important that the developmental delay classification is used, because it's really protecting your child from getting too harsh of a disability classification too early, which can really impede their access to general education experiences. So this might result in them being in a substantially separate classroom when that wasn't where they really needed to be. I've had a student, just to go more onto that, he was identified as having an intellectual impairment at age 3 and was put in a substantially separate classroom. When I evaluated him at age 11, he had intact cognitive abilities, but because he had been so limited by the content he was receiving, the education he was receiving, the academics he was exposed to, he was performing similarly to his peers that he was with. And that was because he wasn't exposed to the right experiences for his cognitive and academic level of development. So it's really important that you have that developmental delay classification, because that can go away very easily. Intellectual impairment, once that's on your child's record, it can be very useful, especially driving services later in life, but it's just definitely something you want to make sure is accurate before it gets put on your child's IEP. So going on to question 2 about, so the first part of question 2 is your child making effective progress in the general education program? So if your child has a disability, but is still making effective progress, they're going to say your child is not eligible for special education. The next one is the lack of progress a result of the student's disability? So is your student's disability the reason why they're not able to access the general education curriculum? Reasons that could result in them not being able to access the general education curriculum that isn't disability is situations that, oh, here we go. Lack of appropriate instruction, so not enrolled in school, chronic absenteeism, Tier 2 interventions haven't been tried, so that's going to be those small group instruction that is tried with your child to see maybe a little bit of acute reading instruction is all they need just to be able to get them back up to grade level. When in reality, it's going to be, that might be what they need, but they might need more. So that would be when you go to the next step. Another reason you might not qualify is because of limited English proficiency. If your child cannot speak English or doesn't understand the English language, it's not really fair for us to call them disabled, because it might just be that they can't access the tests that we're testing them in. They need to be able to be at a certain level of English language development to be able to know what we're asking them. And if it's just that they don't know because they don't speak the right language, then that's not their fault. It's not being disabled just because you don't speak English. And then finally, does the student require special education and/or related services to make effective progress or to access the general education curriculum? So this is going to be really, is it the disability that's causing it, and then can special education or related services help them access that a little bit more effectively? So here's that squeaky wheel again coming through on the screen. So this is another opportunity to advocate. So this goes back to that multiple disabilities classification I talked about. So you want to make sure you're advocating for your child's IEP to accurately reflect their disability. So one of the disability classifications is multiple disabilities, and while the IEP team may identify this category as appropriate for your child, because it's usually used for children that have more significant needs, and that tells team chairs, hey, this is a child that has more significant needs. And that's about all it tells you. So it doesn't communicate any valuable information about the student. So it's better to have each of the individual disabilities reflected in the primary, secondary, and tertiary disability sections. This helps if your child's team changes over time, which it absolutely will. It helps to make sure that that information is being passed on from team to team. And this ensures that the impact of your child's disability is considered and none of the needs slip through the cracks. It's really easy for a child with a visual impairment who is also maybe on the autism spectrum to be labeled as having multiple disabilities. But then all of the autism spectrum disorder needs that they have aren't addressed because everyone sees it as the visual impairment, because that's what they're interpreting. A child who's rocking really heavily into their chair for that sensory input because of the autism might be, oh no, that's just a visual thing, when in reality it's bigger than that. And it's making sure that each of those things are captured in the IEP to make sure your child is accurately represented by the document that is supposed to be helping to educate them. So reevaluation, so this is if your child's found eligible, once they are on an IEP, every 3 years your child will be reevaluated to determine if they would continue to qualify. Again, this is a little bit different for children with sensory impairments because most children with sensory impairments will continue to qualify just based off of the needs associated with the sensory impairments, because they're going to need accommodations and different technology or different accommodations to be able to access that general education curriculum. So reevaluations, you don't have to do them if you don't want to. If you feel like your child's already on the right track and you don't really want them to have to go through that process, you can waive them if you want. If you feel like it's really traumatic for your child or it's really impacting their ability to feel safe in their academic environment, maybe it's better to hold off or to do a lighter evaluation every 3 years rather than having them go the whole full gambit every 3 years. And also, just because you can waive it doesn't mean it has to happen every 3 years. It can happen sooner if additional concerns arise. All you have to do is request it. Usually it can be done as soon as a year earlier, and it just requires consent from the guardian. Student's disability classification cannot be changed without an evaluation. All right, so that's the first part. So that's part one. If anyone has any questions, I wanted to stop now before I start continually just heaping information on you. If not, I will just keep on going. Yes?
For the pre-evaluation consultation,
yeah.
Who would you request that through? Would that be like through your town's special education board?
Yep, the director of special education, whoever you're reaching out for the initial evaluation to begin with, I would say, hi, can we have a pre-information conference just so we can get on the same page, just to make sure that everything's in order and that we're able to get our child evaluated accurately and efficiently.
Yeah.
Yes?
And by the law, are you only allotted one meeting, or is it more than one meeting?
You know, the law wasn't very specific in that regard, so I can't say for sure, but I'm going to guess that you would be able to have as many meetings as you felt you needed, because really the IEP process, it is meant to have the parents be a participant. You guys are part of the IEP team, you are on the IEP team, so your concerns are just as valid as anyone else's. So I would say if you feel like you need more than one, have more than one.
And does that
one?
What was that?
1 per year.
1 per year? Yeah.
Test. Evaluation.
Yes, absolutely.
And is that, are you only covered under that law if you sign the permission to evaluate form, or is it in the process leading up to it that you're entitled to?
You're protected by this law no matter what, because it's part of the IDEA, so the No Child Left Behind Act, all of that. Your child is just protected just because they are entitled to the free, appropriate public education. So because they're protected by that, just because you don't sign your name right away, doesn't mean you don't have those rights still.
When it comes to the data that you showed, does it pertain to Massachusetts or?
It's federal.
US?
It's the whole U.S.
Or US?
Yep, and that information was pulled right off of the Department of Education's website, and they update that pretty annually, I believe. One caveat I will say to the eligibility determination is Iowa. I don't know if anyone lives there, but if you do, they don't actually determine which disability you have. They just determine that you are at a level of disability needing services. So they won't actually label you as what your disability is. They just say you just need an IEP and that's it. Whether or not that's better or not, I don't know, but just one weird state.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Is IEP team after evaluation is deciding which classification child?
Usually, the evaluations are used for that. It might be a little different in terms of a child with sensory impairments, just because typically an eye doctor or just a child's pediatrician will be the one that provides that documentation. So, like a psych eval won't determine their level of visual impairment. PT eval won't determine their level of visual impairment. So it really, for that type of its sensory impairment, it's going to be a little bit different in terms of eligibility determination. It's definitely less of something to worry about if your child has that type of impairment, just because it is typically more cut and dry. It's not like ADHD where it's, a matter of, in some cases, opinion whether a child's struggling with that. A child with visual impairment, it's a little less of an opinion of what the child's actually going through. Awesome. Any other questions before I start moving on? Awesome. So so there's 3 parts to this process, and the next one is the IEP development. So your child they have determined they are eligible for services. Hooray! Now they get an IEP. So if the IEP determines, then this is when we start trying to figure out what is this IEP going to work towards? What are the goals? What are the objectives? And it's also developed with the entire IEP team in mind. So as I said, the next step is to develop the IEP, and it really is a district by district, state by state difference. You will see there's a very big spectrum of, some districts that will immediately go to whatever the parent wants, and then you have the other side that will immediately fight whatever the parent wants. And it really, you don't never know where you're going to end up until you get there. And it also can vary in your district based on who your team chair is. So it's really a process that can be very variable, but all of the tips I'm telling you will apply to any district, any state, because they're protected by your federal rights and they're not just state rights. So like I said, I'm just saying my whole slide already. While the document varies itself, these are federal requirements. So I'm going over what the federal government says needs to be on IEP. So the required elements, the first part that is required is the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So in Massachusetts, we call this the PLEP statement, the present levels of educational performance. So in this documents the impact of a child's disability on their ability to make progress, the accommodations a student may need to make effective progress, and then any modifications to the curriculum content, methodology, or delivery of instruction, and performance criteria. So performance criteria is tests, quizzes, homework, anything that is your child's grade is gonna be based off of. Give you a sec, okay? So here's that squeaky wheel coming through again. Another opportunity to advocate. So the PLEP is going to be make or break for your child's education in the public education setting, because a lot of public school educators aren't familiar with what it takes to educate a child with a visual impairment, a blind child, a deafblind child. Because as we saw by how many students fall into those populations, many teachers have never had that opportunity to teach a child with a visual impairment. So like I said, this will document any adjustments that need to be made in how your child's taught. So accommodations and modifications are going to be imperative. The impact of their disability may have on their ability to naturally access information through incidental learning. So as we know, children with visual impairments aren't able to see what their peers are doing at all times. So that means they can't learn through just watching what they're doing. They need to be explicitly taught a lot of different tasks or a lot of different skills that just come through natural environmental learning. So it's important that in those accommodations and modifications to curriculum that we're explaining that to the teachers, that when you're talking about maybe a color, or maybe you're talking about, when something gets really hot, it gets red. Talking about something like that, you're gonna have to really explicitly break that down. Maybe you're breaking down what nonverbal language looks like, and how, a child that isn't able to see other children doesn't interpret, them moving away from them, or doesn't interpret them, having closed off body language. And these are the things that we need to explicitly teach them. So we need to tell the teachers how to do it. So it's also, most academic settings are super visual. You know, they're art-based, you're painting, you're doing a lot of colors and all of those types of things. It's important that we break down in the accommodations and modifications how to address the different types of curriculum through more tactile or auditory experiences, using the other 4 senses we have to be able to help them learn. If the PLEP statement isn't providing enough information for your child, many general education and special education teachers will struggle to know how to modify their lesson plans. And they'll think that just describing something to a child is enough, when in reality, you need to provide the child a diverse set of, you know, experiences just like any other child. It just might be through different means. Maybe you're listening to something, listening to sounds of fall rather than looking at different colored leaves. Maybe you're feeling different textures rather than just talking about how things look. So it's really making sure that those things are outlined so the teachers know how to address them. So the functional performance. As I previously said, the PLEP statement, that's what we call it in Massachusetts. But you'll notice that functional performance isn't in that acronym. And just because it's not in the acronym doesn't mean that we aren't required to address those needs. All intervention needs to address any area of academic and functional performance. This is something that you might get a lot of pushback on, but this is what gives the district the responsibility of teaching the expanded core curriculum, which I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about. But those are those implicit skills that you learn through incidental learning that you need a little bit more explicit teaching around. So social skills, tech skills, work skills, that's what, it's the and functional performance, that's what qualifies your children for that. So if a district says, oh, those aren't school skills, we don't have to work on those there. Yes, they are, because it's about their functional performance, a child's ability to get around their environment, orientational mobility. A lot of us, I don't think we learned how to walk and get around our environment at school, but that's because we didn't need to. A child with a visual impairment may need that in school. And the reason that they are entitled to that is because of the functional performance. They need to functionally be able to access their environment to access the general education curriculum. So the next required element of the IEP are measurable academic and functional goals. So this is going to be the goal areas of each that every child has. And all IEPs are required to have goals that change on an annual basis. These goals must be observable and measurable, address academic and functional need areas, meet the child's needs that result from the child's disability, and enable the child to participate in and make progress in the general education curriculum. So these things are all very important because this is really what's going to be the meat and potatoes of your IEP. These are going to be the skills, the umbrella skills that your child is working towards gaining. And I'll give you guys a second to. And then, so we also need to meet each of the child's needs that result from the child's disability. So that is going to be all of their ECC needs. We got to make sure that we're covering all of those. The next required element is going to be a description of how progress towards goals is tracked. In Massachusetts, we call this the objectives. So under each goal, you have objectives to get you to that goal. So these are the baby steps to get you to the bigger goal. So like I said, so objectives are going to define the specific skills that are going to be targeted. So maybe your child's goal is to get to, I'm trying to do it in the way that Perkins has trained us to do it, but it's going to be challenging sometimes, especially since I'm not an academic teacher. But if your child is trying to get to a certain level of reading or math, the little steps that take them to get there. So maybe they're just about there with multiplication, but they need to work on their multiplication facts. The objective might be your child will accurately have all of the multiplication facts in 80% of opportunities. So that would be the specific skill that's being targeted, is teaching those multiplication facts. The criteria for a student to achieve the progress and make progress towards the goal. So what is it that your child needs to do to be able to be successful? Success needs to be outlined because it's important for your child to have that opportunity to be successful. The interval of progress reporting is often outlined in the section 2. Most school districts report 4 times per year, so there's 4 reporting periods. There's also the service delivery grid. So this is going to be any of the services that your child provides, and it's going to be clarifying who is giving your child each individual service, what type of provider are they? Are they a special educator, a teacher of the visually impaired? How frequently are they getting it? Are they getting it once a week, once a month? And then the setting. So is it happening within the special education, general education, or outside of those, or is it consultation? So like I said, there's 3 different ways. So it can be consultation. This is not a student direct service. So this is going to be anytime a related service provider or a special educator is consulting with another provider for your child and helping them to know the best way to support them. So a lot of times this could be like an immobility instructor helping with knowing how to set up a classroom, or an occupational therapist helping with maybe fidgets or seating arrangements so a child's able to stay engaged. Inside the general education classroom, so this might be a push-in service. Speech is going into the gen ed classroom where your child's learning and helping support them through the general education lesson. Or it could happen outside the general education classroom. So this could be in a substantially separate classroom, or maybe it's a one-on-one setting with a speech pathologist, and that's how they're getting their speech lessons. So it could really vary depending on what your child needs. Finally, I think, is the non-participation justification. So the federal law requires the IEP to include a statement about why and to what extent your child is outside of the general education classroom and when they're not able to participate in extracurricular activities. This goes back to just making sure your child's in the least restrictive environment. So if they're not in the least restrictive environment, which is the general education classroom, there needs to be a reason for that. Why are we taking them out of that setting and putting them into a more restrictive setting? Then there'll also be another section. This you guys don't have to worry about for a long time because it's all about state or district-wide assessments. This is MCAS, stuff like that. But you do need to include information about your child's ability to take these tests, if they needed any accommodations, or if there was an adjustment to the actual assessment that they would take. In Massachusetts, we have the MCAS, but for students with more significant disabilities, they might do the MCAS alt, which is them showing progress towards the subject area, but maybe not on a goal or a grade level that would make sense for their age. So the IEP team determines if a student would benefit from taking an alternate assessment. A justification is required for why the student is unable to participate in the standard assessment, why the alternative assessment is appropriate, and that is, like I said, not something you really have to worry about for a while. So the federal government does have a couple of special considerations for different populations that need to be considered, and of course they're all for our populations because we have very special populations. So for students who are blind, visually impaired, or deafblind, Braille instruction is to be provided, period. That's it. They have to get Braille instruction. Obviously, there's a little of a caveat for students with visual impairments with a lot of functional vision. If they're able to access print, it's typically best that they are accessing print because that's going to be the more accessible, the more universal academic modality for them to use. But if they have a significant level of visual impairment, they are blind or deafblind, they should be receiving some level of Braille instruction. You can discontinue Braille instruction if it doesn't seem like it's an appropriate fit, but that's only if there's an evaluation done by a teacher of the visually impaired, and we'll get to that, a little bit more of that. For students who are deaf or hard of hearing, their communication needs must be considered. This includes opportunities for direct communication and instruction in their language, communication mode, and at their academic level. This is really talking about students who are deafblind or hearing impaired that use sign language to communicate. So you want to make sure that students who are communicating with sign language are being exposed to sign language or have a sign language interpreter, that they have the opportunity to expand their language skills. And then finally, a student's assistive technology needs should be considered. So we're going to have a couple of squeaky wheels coming through now. So the first one is the learning media assessment. Shout out Kate. she's one of our TVIs in the secondary program and does most of our learning media assessments. But this is the assessment that you're going to use to find out how does your child learn most effectively? What is the most appropriate instructional modality? So what is an instructional modality? That could be how they access their academic materials. So an LMA is an assessment used to determine the appropriate literacy media for students with visual impairments by determining their sensory channel preferences. Are they a visual learner, tactile learner, auditory learner? So literacy media is the way the student accesses reading materials, and can include anything from print, audio, braille, tactile media, or pictures, or even a combination of those. This assessment is typically done by a TVI. And for younger students, the LMA can include information on the best way to calm a student or to alert them, and strategies to promote effective use of senses. In addition to the LMA, usually a functional vision assessment is also done, and this is evaluation of your child's functional vision and the amount of vision that they continue to have, their field of vision, and how they use their vision. And what that can tell you is what types of technology might need to be considered, how much accommodation does your child need, how much are they able to access visually through their environment. Oh, where did I put that? There it is. Okay. All right, and then we have another squeaky wheel. So this is for deafblind children's communication. For deafblind children, the ability to communicate their needs and wants will be one of the most important skills to develop. I could probably say that for all children. But these skills are the most challenging for deafblind students with dual sensory impairments to acquire through incidental learning. You have to think, if you can't see and you can't hear, the amount of information you're getting from your environment is limited. What you're getting from your environment is usually what's being given to you directly. So incidental learning isn't happening as much as you'd want it to. So it's important that we're making sure there's opportunity for communication. So a total communication approach is a method of communication that uses as many modalities as possible to increase a child's opportunity to receive information. So what that might look like is I might have what I'm talking about represented up here by pictures. I might be signing at the same time while talking. That's me using a total communication system to be able to give a child that doesn't have as many opportunities to get information from their environment as many opportunities as possible. And that way, they are being exposed to so many different communication methods that they can start employing some of these. They can start leveraging some of the different, maybe it's a picture exchange communication system where you're exchanging pictures for their needs to be met. So like I said, this may include sign language, tactile sign language, when you sign into someone's hand, pictures, tactile objects, brailled objects, spoken language, etc.